Hello and welcome to Perennial Podcast. I'm going to try this again. Okay. It's not saying it's live yet.
I
Now it
just
is.
got
Okay.
something that's live.
Hello and welcome to Perennial Podcast, episode 13. We had some technical issues for the last several hours, but we're on now, and we have a great topic to discuss, which is ideological progressions. So it's been commented on frequently that a lot of libertarians moved over to nationalist politics. And I think that there's a broader story here, and maybe we can form some more general narratives. And hopefully Ken can describe a bit of his own journey in that respect. And we might be talking also about Ryan Falk and Greg Johnson. So, Ken, why don't you give us the breakdown of the basic progression we're talking about here?
Right. So it's the progression from, I would say, the neoconservative to libertarian to ethno-nationalist, and where I'm at now is more of a ethno-religionist or minoritarian. And each of these makes sense given like the context of a belief system. So like if you believe that Muslims are invading the West, then it makes sense to be a neoconservative. If you then believe that like the globalists are, or like George Bush is using Islamic terrorism, or that globalists are using Islamic immigration to, justify the NSA or to abuse the demos, then you might become a libertarian, say that government equals bad, so we need to have less government. As you explore libertarianism, you see how the demos, the people, naturally abuse themselves, or they allow themselves to be abused because of their inability to take responsibility for themselves. And then you might move on to something like ethno-nationalism, where you say that we really need an organic hierarchy that prevents the elite from abusing the demos and prevents the demos from abusing themselves or being led astray, because there's this shared ethnic genetic interest between the populace and the elite. And then you look at the world we have today, where we have increasing globalization. There's really no reversing it. You could slow it down, like Trump's wall. You could slow it down, but it wouldn't reverse the trends that are in course. Everyone is becoming more Americanized around the world, and America is becoming more global. And you could not balkanize the United States in this present situation in the same way that you couldn't split India into a Brahmin state and an untouchable state. That's not the structure of India. We are, as a civilization, as a world, becoming more Hinduized. Our world is filled with Brahmin castes. Those are the literal Brahmins, Jews, Mormons, basically any minority that perceives itself as an in-group that has a kind of quasi-ethnic religion that promotes its own interests. And that is why, for instance, you have an Israeli ethno-state, you have a Jewish ethno-state, and Israeli Jews still move to America to live here. And if ethno-nationalism was truly the best ideology, it wouldn't make sense for people of one group to move away from their ethno-state into a diverse state. But that's exactly what happens, because actually ethno-nationalism is not the end-all and be-all. When you have this globalist context, really the best strategy to pursue is an ethno-religion. That's why I think that instead of focusing on how do we plan the next rally or the next political party or get like this guy elected to Congress, we should focus on forming a religion, which means we have to go through the hard task of hashing out metaphysics. Who are the saints? What are the sacred texts? What are the rituals? That is something that elites need to be doing. Currently, all the religious discussion is infantile, Christian versus pagan, or like really immature stuff. And that's what people associate with the conversation. But the conversation needs to be had on a high level, on a deep level. And that's kind of the basic framework of what I'm thinking. Now, you could take each of these and discuss why people become a neoconservative and then why people leave neoconservatives. And there's a lot of in-depth stuff we could do with each of the stages. But I think there is a progression here. You do see it with people like Ryan Falk was a neoconservative. He became a libertarian, and now he's kind of an ethno-nationalist. Same thing with Greg Johnson, started off as a neoconservative, explored libertarianism, and then became an ethno-nationalist. So I think there is a logical progression here. And I think there is a fourth stage, there is a fourth step that needs to be further explored.
Yeah, I agree. I'm not sure how many people on in the deep right, as the term that you invented for that, how many people there are really thinking in terms of religion. I know that, so let's take the example of Nick Fuentes. He's using Catholicism, and many of the doctrines of the Catholic Church are compatible with some forms of nationalism, and the Christian eschatology does allow for the preservation of the nation. Israel is supposed to kind of lead a community of nations, not one world state, one mass globo homo society. So, I'm curious whether we can take the Nick Fuentes route and just use Christianity, don't make any of these drastic innovations work. Like, I don't believe it, but obviously most people are inclined to go that way. And religion is not typically a rational, designed kind of thing. It's a manifestation of the collective unconscious, and we kind of just have to take what's given to us in that respect. But other people, like, let's take, for example, Weave. He did actually with I think some other people, start a Protestant sect, kind of in the spirit of the Independent Baptist Church of Pastor Anderson in Tempe, Arizona, where he would, name the Jew, call out the synagogue of Satan, and proclaim nationalism, basically. And there's a lot of resources in Christianity for putting forward a traditional way of life, and which is why I identify as Christian, also perennialist, because I think you can't ever let go of the actual handed down tradition that you've received. My own opinion is that the underlying metaphysics of perennialist systems, monist systems, are tenable. They're, at least the presuppositions are simple, and I can understand more or less how the world works, what the world is. But yeah, in order to have that, you have to also accept that this transmission from the ancient past to the modern day is itself something to preserve. Porky Longpig, a religion that allows for individual states is not optimal. Now, you could be talking there about like you want something that enforces individual states or enforces national sovereignty. I don't know, let's look at like the Catholic Church. That didn't just allow for national sovereignty, it actually in many cases created national sovereignty, legitimated national sovereignty, and there was cooperation between the church and the national monarchs. And it's questionable whether the nation state as we know it could have emerged out of the kind of like feudal Germanic kind of many kingdoms, many fiefdoms kind of model. I'm not sure, but let's go back and start at the beginning. I also have one comment to make about the setup. We changed the audio. Hopefully it sounds better. If it does sound better, let us know. If it sounded better before, also inform us of that. But let's go back to the neoconservative angle, because I was sympathetic with those arguments at a certain point in time. I remember I took a debate class in college, and we were arguing the Syria question and basically American interventionism generally. Now, I wasn't big into left-right, Democratic, Republican politics until college. Porky says it sounds fine, so that's good. But I kind of just stumbled across the main thrust of the neoconservative argument, which is we need American hegemony to make sure that weapons of mass destruction don't proliferate. And Nick Fuentes uses the same line. There's truth in that. But the question is, what are you trying to defend and what are you trying to prevent? And the basic, conception of legitimate political authority is something that neoconservatism doesn't really address. It just presupposes. It's indistinguishable from the neoliberal legitimation of the state. Okay, so, but where did you come from? I'm assuming, Ken, you were a neoconservative at some point?
Yeah, I identified in some ways with George Bush as being like the moral majority of the country, or just being like an average American. And I was very distressed to find that it seemed as if the majority of the country was against him. This created a kind of a crisis for me, because I thought that, we should be a unified country. We should kind of be a moderate country, and we should have a leader popularly elected by the demos to represent us. And the idea that you would have people who would elect a guy twice and then radically change their opinion of him to make him a very unpopular president, the idea that that would happen either told me that the people were very flawed in making this mistake, or that he was very flawed. And therefore, you go back to the original problem of the people were flawed to select him. This is when I started to move into libertarianism, because I said this democratic process of selecting people to be our president isn't working out. We need a better system. And maybe we need a market-based system. We need to put power in the hands of people who the market selects. And that's basically, the Randian objectivist thing where the captains of industry rule over society. It's also kind of a technocratic idea. So I started to move in that direction. But the basic impulse there to buy into neoconservatism was the idea of, if we're being attacked by Muslims, as was the general narrative at the time in the early 2000s, we should respond. We have to invade their territory. We have to fix things there. We have to spread democracy. It's democracy versus Islam in a way. And we have to unify behind that. And the people who are then criticizing the president or saying that the measures are too harsh or something, they're not going to solve the problem. They're going to let the problem linger, and it's only going to fester and get worse. I mean, to me, 9/11 was like the first attack in a war. And I could see things. I mean, I was like, what happens if a nuke goes off? And that was like the next logical step. So from my perspective, my opinion, it was this ideological thing of civilization versus barbarism. What happened was I took up that position, and then I started trying to argue with people as to why my position was right. And they came out with all this stuff about the New World Order, globalists, mind control, Alex Jones type stuff, back tracing, saying that our culture, our media, our government is created to enslave us. This is the Stefan Molyneux line. I didn't discover him until much later, but that is kind of the way the libertarians come at you. And at that time, they were a little more, well, the progression of left libertarianism versus right libertarianism is an interesting one. But at that time, it was just saying there's this big evil corporate government structure that is enslaving people through Hegelian narratives about terrorism, about Islam. We need to break out of that. We need to have a system that's not corrupt. And I would then argue for libertarianism. As I did that, I discovered that people really are making bad choices. Now, as a libertarian, I had all kinds of arguments about why it was really the government that was pushing corn syrup on us and making us fatter. But ultimately, people were making uninformed choices to make themselves fatter, as a very visceral, visual example of how people make choices that they might desire that food, but ultimately, are they having happier lives, more satisfied lives? Like, what do people need versus what do people want? And when those needs and wants contradict, how do we parse that out? How do we limit the sovereignty of individuals? Because certainly children are not sovereign. And so we have a cultural system, an organic biological system called the family. And the family is meant to administer children who are not sovereign. If we extend this concept of sovereignty to adults, we say that different adults have different degrees of sovereignty, and therefore they need different biological extended families to administer their behavior. And that's really where the ethno-state comes in, and ethno-nationalism, the idea that children need a family, adults need an extended family, and that's what nationalism is. The problem, of course, is that we are not in the 19th or 20th century. We don't have ethno-states. We're entering a situation where the people who are going to succeed are these minoritarian groups with ethno-religions. They don't need an ethno-state. In fact, there are a lot of Jews like George Soros who think that Israel is a liability. As an ethno-state, it doesn't provide the Jewish community with a lot of advantages, and there's a lot of disadvantages to having a state where you have Jewish men with guns shooting unarmed children, for example. That's not a good look. And in fifth generational warfare, it's really all about the optics. It's really all about winning the hearts and minds, the information war. So there are a lot of Jews who are against nationalism, not because they hate Jewish people, but because they don't see ethno-nationalism as being in the Jewish interest. They believe that they should stick with an ethno-religious rather than an ethno-nationalist strategy. And I think that is one that everyone is going to need to adapt. Part of it is because of technology. I mean, part of it could have been avoided. Let's say if World War II went differently, maybe we'd be looking at a different world today. But we have to deal with the facts that are on the ground. And I think the first and foremost priority is to form an ethno-religion. If that is a Christian ethno-religion, great. And I agree with you that you can't look at human psychology as a blank slate. And so we have a culture, we have a people, they're all different kinds of people with different subcultures. And we can't just look at reality as it is, reject it, and start completely anew, or say, like, we're going to reject Christianity and go back to paganism. With that said, I think you also can't reject paganism, because paganism is part of the Christian tradition, in my view. So that's why I like the term perennialist, because it takes a very long view of things, and it incorporates a lot of different schools, and it says there's actually value in a lot of different schools, and then it gives you a lot of more room to maneuver. But once you have that room to maneuver, then you have to come together and unify and specify and agree upon a system of ritual, a system of metaphysics. What is the actual coherent thing? Because general perennialism, like, there are a lot of people who call themselves perennialist, and that in itself is not an identity. It's not an in-group. How do you narrow down an in-group from a general perennialist worldview? I think that is the challenge that faces people, and that's the thing that should be worked on. And I don't think it's made explicit enough. There are a lot of people who want to shy away from it. There are a lot of people who are atheists or former atheists, and they're kind of afraid of religion, and they kind of just wish we could just not talk about that. In the same way that people don't want to talk about race or politics generally. It's an uncomfortable topic, but at some point you do have to step back and view things objectively. So obviously, if you look at Ryan Falk's analysis, and I think Sean Last has done this as well, Christian conservative white people in America have the highest birth rates, and they will be the future of the white community in America. Now, it's the same thing in the Jewish community. There is a Jewish Orthodox community, and that is the future of the Jewish community. As that biological process continues of birth rates, you also have a mimetic process. So as Orthodox people have children, some of them convert to atheism, some of them become transsexuals, right? So they leave the Orthodox community. It's the same thing with the white Christian conservative community. As you have kids, some of them grow up to identify as gay, some of them leave Christianity, etc. So there is a biological process, and then there's a mimetic process. We have to ask ourselves, as basically amateur sociologists, how is that going to play out? But the clear, at least on the biological side of things, is that in the future, the vast majority of white people in America are going to be descended or come out of Christian conservative families. So that is basically the bedrock that you have to start with. And if you're going to reject that and come up with something completely foreign to that to start with, that is a very isolated, alienated position to take on. It's not something that's organic. It's not something, if you look at, people will say something like, oh, well, Jesus said, I'm going to set the Father against the Son and the Son against the Father, or whatever. But still, you can see the ways in which Christianity was taking a problematic Judaism and trying to take something out of that and make something workable, not something where it would be in complete opposition to Judaism, but have some kind of synthesis. And that's what I think people need. Obviously, Christianity, as it is in the mainstream, is not the optimal religion, right? So it's very problematic in that it denies basic truths about human nature and who we are as people. And it's problematic in its orientation, its priorities, its activities, its praxis that comes out of its ideology, that comes out of its view of gender relations. So, there's deep flaws here. And Nick Fuentes has to address this with the Catholic Church of, you have the Pope coming out and saying the death penalty is wrong, saying that, women should be speaking in church, that you should have a flood of refugees. So he's saying one thing, and then you have Catholic tradition saying a different thing, and that's very hard to reconcile. But it needs to be worked on, and I think that's why it's important to have a big perennialist view, but with the goal of somehow hashing out some sort of solution, which I think is basically the overall theme of this podcast, is that we come in with really big ideas and we're trying to hash it out and not just say, live and let live. You have your opinion, I have my opinion. Ultimately, we do have to learn a way to get along, a way to have common rituals, a way to have a common metaphysics that we can agree on. Because if we can't come together in those commonalities, we are going to lose the struggle that's going on. It's not an ethno-nationalist struggle. It's not Germany against Russia against America, because within Germany and Russia and America, there are billionaires who are basically all on the same page. They all hate Putin to one extent or another. They're all pro-Merkel. They're pro-Hillary. They're anti-Trump, whatever. They're pretty much on the same page. It doesn't matter what country they're in. And the people basically also in these countries have a unified interest. So it's not about ethno-state against ethno-state. It's really about global minorities and global majorities. And the struggle is between the minorities, and the majorities are basically left to, deal with the consequences of what the minorities decide.
Right. Well, that was a lot of stuff. So let's address some of the religious aspects, and then maybe double back and then start focusing in on libertarianism again. And I think all of these have aspects that pertain to each other. So Lightning Patriot asks, would you call Catholicism perennialist? So this kind of has to do with the Nick question. And I would say that Catholicism trends towards perennialism. I think that the logical implication, and Jay Dyer believes this as well, the logical implication of absolute divine simplicity is the kind of monistic, panentheistic conception that you find in Hinduism. It's just that there's certain revelatory presuppositions that you have to maintain in the Catholic framework, but I think that give it 500 years and it doesn't necessarily have to remain there. And we don't like what the Pope has been saying. We don't like some of the social commentary and some of what's filtering down into elements of the magisterium, although maybe not the infallible aspects of the magisterium. But that shows that this structure can be developed into something else, right? In the early 1900s, in the late 1800s, the Catholic Church was altogether anti-progressive, very conservative. They supported Franco. They supported that dictator in Croatia. They tacitly supported Hitler. They were something very different from what they are today. And that was because of the Jesuits. And so maybe that gives us a clue as to how the Catholic Church could be saved, more or less. You have an order within a religion, so an order within the Catholic Church, which has its own norms, which has its own doctrines, more or less, its own sacred writings, so to speak, the Loyola writings. And this has an implication because of the kind of implicit ethics in the founding documents. This provides some direction to the people in this order, and to have a conception of the good that leads to their social activism, or what they engage with politically, socially. So that can be done again. And as far as, let's just step back from this comment about Catholicism and talk about Christianity and perennialism generally. I think that there's a reading of the New Testament that suggests that Jesus himself believed in an initiatory order as the structure of his religion, because he explicitly says, I say things in parables so that they won't know what I'm saying. Right? So I mask the truth from those who are not ready to receive it. And if you look at it in its proper context, the religion and the iconography and early architecture of some of these churches, the Orphic themes are still present. The Manichaean development is something to look at, and Mithraism in its relationship to early Christianity. All the milieu in which early Christianity developed was an environment filled with secret societies, filled with initiatic orders. And this is how the church spread. And at some point, I think you could very easily make the argument, maybe with Paul, maybe with somebody else, the church took a left turn, and Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism are not shining exemplars of the actual Christian ethos. Do Christian nations, canonical, or rather, like supposedly apostolic Christian nations behave in accordance with the teachings? No. And there's an obvious contradiction there. Now, what Nick does is just to say that, well, corporate entities don't have volition in the same sense as an individual, so a nation can't be wrong. It's just kind of this nihilistic power play at the global level that you just have to accept, and Christian morals don't apply to state actors. And it seems to me that that's somewhat of a cop-out. So yeah, my own inclination would be to question the development of the apostolic tradition all the way back to its founding, and to understand the mythological context so that the new initiates can be aware of that. The new initiates can be aware of the perennial tradition in the form of all the documents that we have, right? There's an actual heritage, there's a library of stuff that you could read about world religion that would more or less inform you of the evolving spirituality of our race. And that is not for everybody, and for many people, being exposed to that, even knowing the basic tenets of Buddhism or Hinduism, would detract from your lived conviction in the Christian ethic. Because once it becomes one among many to most people who aren't of this kind of open-minded liberal mentality, which I natively am, most people can't entertain multiple notions or hypotheses regarding a given case. They have to pick a side and they have to defend it. And if you can't do that, then perennialism is toxic, and you're not going to have any morals because you're going to question everything down to the level of the individual. So what you need is a priest caste or class. You need a priesthood that teaches this stuff to the people who are ready to receive it, but not to everyone. And there has to be phases of being initiated into this. So what I imagine, and this has to take an institutional structure at some point in time. So Anders Haas asks, how would such a religion be structured? Like a knighthood? You would have to keep out infiltrators and keep it living and non-static somehow. Yeah, keeping out infiltrators is one of the functions of an initiatic tradition. So, but it has to take an institutional form, and I think at its face value, it would end up looking something like High Church Protestantism. Maintain the Mass, maintain the sacred rituals, and even claim apostolic succession. Brand it, call it something like a traditionalist Catholic Church, right? And you have priests, you have all the same ostensive signs as the Catholic Church, but a different power center controlling it. And that power center, instead of being a celibate clergy, I mean, the clergy could be celibate in this as well, probably actually better if they are, to be honest, but it's not the same Jesuit run kind of progressive, infiltrated, persuasion that controls things in this. So yeah, you go in the doors and it's like a normal Episcopalian service, and you have different classes you can take, and this is a filtering process. You can get to know people. You take confession. That's one of the functions of the confessional, is surveillance, and it always has been. That was a key role of the Catholic Church, a surveillance apparatus, a security agency, basically, of many of these states, like the Holy Roman Empire. So that serves, that the initiatic function is a screen, and it's also like it's there to protect people, not just to keep people out, but to protect people who aren't ready to think about things, and they might never be ready, right? Which is why not everybody's ready to be a priest. Not everyone's ready to make that leap. I was just reading this guy from an American intellectual from like the mid 1800s, Chauncey Wright, and he's like an atheistic, progressive type of thinker, but I like his writing style, and I just didn't know about him. He popped up in a recommended list on Wikipedia, so I looked at him. And he basically describes this sentiment that, a lot of the intellectual elites in the mid-1800s believed in evolution, believed in these kind of novel cosmogonic theories, the nebular hypothesis of planetary formation, all of the emerging materialistic framework, they really believed, but they also believed they had a moral duty not to shake the faith of people who weren't up to that level. And I experienced that myself when I was an atheist, when I was in basic training years ago, and somebody was coming to me. I don't know why they came to me. I think I was the squad leader of the squad he was in, so he felt like he could talk to me. But he said, like, I just found out my grandpa died, and he was very important to me. I would go and fish with him all the time, and this guy was on the verge of either a lot of pain or, coming to terms with a major event in his life. And what was I going to say? Like, he asked me specifically, because he wasn't a Christian. Like, he used to be a Christian, but he didn't really know what he believed. Was I going to tell this guy that, your grandpa, he was the behaviors that came from his brain is gone, now he's gone, but you'll still remember him? It's like, that's so shallow and hollow and empty and worthless to someone who doesn't have like the mindfulness or centeredness that comes with being an intellectual type to order the emotional response. And so I told him, like, you'll see him again one day. Like, I don't know, maybe he's with your deceased relatives, even though I didn't believe it at all. And that's that kind of noble lie, which takes two forms. In Plato, the noble lie is the myth, is the foundation myth. So like in the Republic, the noble lie is the four types of people, the different metals, bronze, gold, whatever it is. And that's a fiction devised to institute a social order. That's one element, the pragmatic aspect of the noble lie. And then there's also the moral aspect of the noble lie. And I didn't used to accept this, even though I lived by it. I think everyone lives by it. The truth is dangerous, and you can't just, send it out without considering the consequences. And I'm going to read the rest of these. Anders Haas, it would have to present a myth-based ritualism that influences and shapes one's deep psychology to create and confirm identity. Yes, exactly, which is why, use the inherited Catholic tradition, use the inherited apostolic, high church, mass-centered religion, which is the ritual, which is the community that is built off of it, and that community structures the deep psyche. And that's very well observed. That's very tested. So we can rely on that aspect. Joe Schmo 123, I agree with the need for an ethnic religion. There are tons of those sorts of African-American sects in the U.S., like Yah Victory and Pastor Dowell on YouTube. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we want to do case studies of ethno-religions, and the, what do they call them, Black Hebrew Israelites. That would be a perfect example to look into. They have large compounds with several hundred people living there, living completely off the land, at least in foodstuffs. Yeah, I mean, it's funny. These leaders, these black leaders, often converge on the minoritarian strategy, and there's a certain kind of like folksy, intuitive wisdom that they have, where they don't get caught by abstractions, and they kind of just see like, oh, we need to collectivize and purchase land together. We need to do these basic things that are just what humans have always done. And when we go back to libertarianism, I kind of do want to mention my own framing for how I came into it, which was communitarian in nature. But that just reminded me. And then heavily armed to know if that would be allowed for white people, though. Yeah, that's the thing. If you try to emulate them, there's one black leader in particular that I'm thinking of that says a lot of points that I agree with for blacks, but I'd like it to be for whites, but it won't be treated the same. Modernism, this is Anders Haas. Modernism creates a kind of repulsive apathy for identity. Yeah, indeed. And then Rattle reminds me of the end of The Dark Knight. Sometimes the truth isn't good enough, lying to the people for the greater good. Yeah, it's not an aspect of things that I enjoy. It's like the truth hurts in this case. And sometimes even that truth, that the truth is dangerous, has to be hidden from some people. But anyway, do you want to now go back and revisit libertarianism, maybe looking at, like, from what you know of Greg Johnson and Ryan Falk, what they did to arrive at it, and do you think there's other roads to libertarianism? Because in my own case, I don't think I was a neoconservative exactly, but like I did agree that libertarianism was the way to reduce corruption.
I don't think Greg Johnson was ever a libertarian, but he did study it, and he was interested in it, and he thought that people were intelligent. Ryan Falk obviously went very deep into it, and it's still difficult to take him out of that. I don't know how to say it, but each of these ideologies has its own dialectic to it, and I still think that has left a mark on him. Certainly his branding on the internet is marked by that. Yeah, I explained why people would get into it generally is that you think of us as good and them as bad. And that's basically the neoconservative worldview. And then you realize, hey, we do a lot of bad things, but then you have to define who we are. Are we the government? Are we the nation? Are we the demos? Are we the intellectual class? Are we the middle class, the lower class, the upper class? What is we? How do we define ourselves? What is our identity? And the libertarian way out of this convoluted, complicated web of identity is just to say we're all individuals. And that's really a very brute force answer to the knots. Just cut it. Say we're all individuals and there is no collective identity. We all just pursue what we want. And the best way for us to achieve all of our desires is to do it in a non-aggressive way, do it through the market without the initiation of force. And I still basically think that is true. I think that if you want, I mean, it's very logical. Libertarianism is very straightforward and cut free from emotionalism. And it just says, in order to give people what you want, you just allow them to pursue what they want without putting limitations on them. You remove laws, you remove bureaucracy, you remove government, but then they just pursue what they want. Well, that's fine if you have people who are very self-restrained, people who have a lot of self-discipline, who have a low time preference, who have a long time horizon, and they can see, hey, if I do this behavior, it might feel good in the short term, but in the long term, it's detrimental. If you have a population like that, like a global elite, then libertarianism is great because they are self-controlling systems. But if you have a population which is not like that, you just get total destruction and nihilism and self-abuse. I mean, the alcoholism, the cutting that teenage girls do, the suicide rates that are increasing, the general drug abuse, the opioids, and then the subcultures that people get into where it is this self-abusive thing, the rise of sarcasm and irony. If you go to like communities that are less touched by modern culture, the whole concept of sarcasm and irony is really sometimes scarily devoid, right? You go to like some Midwestern farmers or something, and they just have the no nonsense approach. No, like they're just extremely honest people. And it's kind of frightening because you're like, wait a second, are these people human, right? We've been socialized in such a ways to think that this is the natural way to go about things. And then you meet these people and they don't have that as a part of their culture. And so that irony and that sarcasm is ultimately a coping mechanism to deal with the emptiness of not having, you might not even have the basic family union. You might have a single mother or a divorced family or split up or whatever. And now, of course, you have all the kinds of like, I don't even know how to describe them, what they say, the LGBT families or the polyamorous families, right? So this is leading people to have like obsessive, compulsive Tumblrs where they just like catalog a lot of pictures of pale girls wearing like the same outfits and or they get really into fashion or they get really into music. Like they distract themselves, they hone in, and it is literally a kind of autism. I mean, what autism by definition is, you ignore people and you focus on things. And you get all these people who are obsessed with comic books, who are obsessed with video games, who are obsessed with fashion, who are obsessed with fitness as an end to itself. And all of these things are distractions from the fact that they don't have any larger community or identity that they're a part of. And I think that's when people start to leave libertarianism and they start to go in a nationalist direction because they want to be part of an in-group. And libertarianism doesn't really have in-groups built into its thing. Now, I know there are a lot of libertarians who will disagree with that. And there's a book that was just reviewed on Countercurrents called, I think, White, Right, and Libertarian. So there are still libertarians who will, make these kind of arguments that are more Lou Rockwell, kind of on the right-wing side of things. But it's not hard-coded into libertarianism. And a lot of libertarians, after Ron Paul's demise, metaphorically speaking, have moved in a leftward direction. And they have moved toward, being more LGBT friendly or trying to attract more Black libertarians or Hispanic libertarians or something. And, you've essentially, you took something that was a very white movement and they've tried to take it in a self-defeating direction, a xenophilic direction. And that's not appealing to people. And I think that's part of the reason why you had so many people join the alt-right or join some kind of ethno-nationalist thing, is to try to escape that. Yeah.
Sarcasm is something to undermine the legitimacy of form. Like, oh, you believe in actual truth, you believe in something, and sarcasm doesn't take itself seriously, irony doesn't take itself seriously, but that humor comes from a conscious place, from a critical place, and that need for formalism does assert itself in other ways. So the person who starts that Tumblr and catalogs things, really, or someone who just takes selfies all the time and posts them up, they're kind of trying to nail down the chaos of their life and have something to hold on to, because at least there's a timeline. Like, yes, I really do exist. I existed last Thursday. I was doing this. Like, it's holding down who they are, but that really doesn't work for everyone. There is a personality type that's extroverted and oriented towards sensation, who they never have to think, and so they don't have to realize the lack of cohesion of what their identity is grounded in. They just have to have activities. And those are the most visible people. Like when you think of popular people, that's the class of people that you're thinking of. And those are the people who post the most to social media. And I think humanity has a skewed self-image which overemphasizes that type. And so to an extent, and also this is visible in major sitcoms like Friends or How I Met Your Mother, or other things like that. They're set in bars, they're set in coffee houses, they're activity-oriented and relationship-oriented to an extent, but in an individual way where we are caught up in the sentimental struggle of these people's experience, and it ends there, and it's chaotic to an extent, but there's also this kind of like comfortable familiarity of the commercial landscape and the fact that they always come back to the coffee house or they always come back to the bar, and that's escaping the formalism of obligation and family and community, and then inevitably seeking alternative formalisms. And, that's something that happens. Spacetime DCR, is there a contradiction between the noble lie and Jesus as the God of truth? And I think this Lightning Patriot kind of answers this in his comment. Using the word lie reminds me how secret/mystery is used in Catholicism. Secret doesn't mean it's being withheld against you or from you, but it's language you learn to read. And that's probably the better way of putting it. The truth, like if it so happens, and this is what I believe, that the ultimate truth is that the forms of our perception and cognition are properties of ourselves ultimately, and not descriptions in the sense of a model of an external world that is real in the same sense as the model is real, but just kind of differently constituted. If it's really that the ultimate is ineffable, the absolute is beyond human comprehension, then the truth is learning to kind of peel back the layers of the ways in which we make meaning about the world. And metaphor is this to an extent, and it allows us to see meta-level connections between things apart from the ordinary conjunctions that are built into our grammar, like relative positions in space, properties pertaining to causal interactions. Metaphor allows us to step back and see the similarity within the difference, and that ultimately is what the perennialist truth is about, the underlying unity of being. So yeah, I don't think there is a contradiction between Jesus as the God of truth and the fact that he uses an initiatic order. I think that's just the way structurally it has to go. Yeah. I'm going to go on and read Anders' stuff. Back in the day, people felt more connection to their community because they were part of it to a larger extent. And yes, that has to do with the material constellation of interests. If we don't have a constellation of material interests with the people around us, we don't form lasting bonds with them. You don't form lasting friendships with people that you don't have an interest, a selfish interest in being around. If you are going to the bar, then sitting at a table with a group of people means that you as an individual are more valuable than if you were there by yourself. And so there's a reason to keep going back to those bonds. And I think that has to be an element of how we structure communications networks. So we have to create incentives to maintain persistent communications in the absence of this kind of organic constellation of immediate material interests that people used to rely on. People used to make things locally, everything. Yeah, there was that organic material context. Ken? Are you raising your hand? I guess that was just not intentional. So, I'm going to go back and now tell my version of how I came into libertarianism. And I never really got into the major authors or any of the theory. It was a basic moral intuition. I wrote a paper for senior politics class, or civics class, about my political platform. You had to write a platform for a political party, and I wrote basically what Ryan Falk ended up talking about with omniseparatism. Now, this was before that. I think he started talking about that stuff in like 2012 or 2013. But that was my basic notion, that you have some people who believe in conservatism, Christian conservatives, or social conservatives. People believe in like liberal tax policies and all of these different things. And I just kind of figured, why can't we just divide up the country and let everybody have what they want instead of trying to compromise on things and never really get things to work, right? Like, if you're a progressive and you believe in the utility of government, then having conservatives and libertarians there voting against you and kind of gumming up the works, then you're not going to have what you want. If you have libertarians and they want to be left alone, having progressives constantly demanding and seeking rents, then you're not going to have what you want. It's like, why do we do this? I was probably influenced partly by the Poisonwood Bible, which is a book I was told to read for a class in high school, maybe 11th grade, 10th grade. It was on the Oprah Book Club reading list, but it was about this missionary family in the Congo, and that point was just kind of made by some African, some wise black woman in that book, who said, like, it doesn't make sense in democracy where you each vote for your side, like no one gets what they want, whereas here we all come to agree with what we want. We reach consensus. We don't tally up votes. And fine, if you're a tribal community of like 20 people, that might work. But yeah, that's kind of what got that idea going in my mind. But it doesn't have to come from the neoconservative angle necessarily, but I did kind of incorporate that in the way I thought of it, in that I have always believed in the U.S. military. I think that American hegemony is a good thing by and large. It prevents the kind of wars that we saw in the last century, or it hypothetically could. Maybe we wage our own wars, but they're on our terms. And in that basic materialistic interest aspect, like, I live here, we're in a very defensible position here. The military is wildly popular compared to other civic institutions. So, if we could maintain that hegemony while also allowing these political differences to like find their own ends in their own way, in their own places, that would be kind of what I'd like to see. And I'm not terribly off from that trajectory, my political model, incorporating like otherness and kind of Schmitt's concept of the friend-foe distinction, friend-enemy distinction. That's the neoconservative angle, incorporating that with libertarianism, in that if you overcome the existence of the foe, that is, if you achieve global hegemony, then you can focus to a greater extent on allowing political experiments to run their course as they please. And so there's a scientific analogy where you want to allow reproducibility in government models. You want people to try out frameworks and let the market kind of decide. Now, if we had a global government that gave people, and I've articulated this before, but that gave people credits for land, and then people collectively associated voluntarily on the basis of whatever, then you would have a patchwork of little nations. If the global government prevented the development of weapons of mass destruction, things like this, I just don't have a problem intuitively with that framework. And many people don't like to think about the global situation or the global solution, but I think that is a major problem. What do you do about the possibility of a Dr. Evil? What do you do about that? And that's the only answer I've really come to. You're going to have a global government. Is that global government going to have a libertarian ethos and structure to as great an extent or as is possible, or not? But on the other hand, that doesn't mean that you prohibit fascist states or prohibit socialist states from forming. So I don't know. I still have the neoconservative argument still speaks to me. The Carl Schmitt argument still speaks to me as a pragmatic reality that kind of takes precedence over everything else. Because if you fail there, it's all over. The libertarian element speaks to me because it allows divergent viewpoints to cooperate while also allowing each of their ambitions to be fulfilled. And then moving into ethno-nationalism, I think that this is just an organic structure. I mainly stick with the fascist conception, like as Mussolini articulated it in, I forget what, like little manifesto of fascism. It's available on YouTube in audio form. But the idea that the nation is an organic process, so I agree with that. But now I look at, now how does a nation come to be? For years I've called myself, like, I believe in ethnogenesis rather than identifying with an ethno-state, because it's not a static entity. Things are evolving, and the environment is changing so fast now, we have to evolve even faster. And geographic integration may not be the best way to achieve this. You need a selective filter. You need a way of bringing people into a gene pool, of defining a gene pool, which in the past was because of geographic features, language, culture, things like that, and it just happened. Or it happened through the Catholic Church, with prohibition against, close cousin marriages and stuff like that. But yeah, in the current context, religion is the only institution we could rely on to define that gene pool. And so those are the four elements that Ken describes in his narrative I find in myself as well. And I think that all of them are still true. It's just which aspect do you emphasize? And I think which element of it encapsulates the rest? That's a pertinent question. And I think religion naturally, as that which binds, is the thing to use, the frame with which to integrate these other viewpoints. Can you?
While you read the
okay,
comments,
you're still there.
Yeah, I wanted to. I think in Western Man, he's saying that fascism is like this third way, but it's not. It's not a way at all. I mean, if you have if you have a country, and I know Germany better than Italy, but if you have a country ruled by a military dictator for 4 years named Hindenburg, and then Hindenburg is elected president. And that is the context. And you have judges who are, when Hitler and Goebbels get arrested for breaking the law, just explain. I think I went dead on here. But,
yeah, you did for a second. I can hear you again. You still there? So while that is happening, I'll go ahead and read Western Man's comment, which is being referred to. Which is why I'm not a libertarian. It's autistic and isn't the best ideological vehicle for maximizing European potential. Social good should morally trump individual freedom, though the two are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Fascism is truly the optimal third way. Okay, Ken, are you back? I heard something. I hear you now, so...
Okay. All right. So anyway, my point was that if you have a country ruled by the former right-wing military dictator whose second in command was Ludendorff, who was one of the leaders of the beer hall putsch, you have judges who are taking Goebbels and Hitler who break the law, and they're like giving them minor fines or reduced sentences, and you basically have a military that is proto-fascist. You have a populace that's proto-fascist, you have a judiciary that's proto-fascist, and then you say, and then fascism came out of this. Well, of course, fascism followed from all of these extremely hard right proto-fascist institutions in society. Then you look at the world we live in today and you say, like, where are the proto-fascist institutions? I mean, the closest one would have to be the military, but then you look at what's happening in the military, where Trump tries to ban transgender individuals from entering the military, and then one of his generals tries to overrule him. So, I mean, at the highest level, the military is a corrupt institution. Of course, the rank and file is something different, but we don't have any of those elements. So when people talk about we need fascism, it's like, no, we need generations of proto-fascism. That is how fascism was created. We don't have proto-fascism. We don't have any of that. So how do you create that? Well, basically you use religion. And at the end of the day, when I talk to people, more and more I'm convinced that you could have any number of things going on in your life. But if you feel like you have some kind of social anchoring, some kind of familial anchoring, some kind of ritualistic anchoring, where there's somewhere you can go and you can feel you're at home, or there's a community you have, or you have friends, or there's something that anchors you. Then you could have any number of material deprivations and still feel fine. In fact, you could be materially deprived and feel even better than you did when you were materially rich, but socially poor, or you just were free floating, like you didn't have any rituals, everything, nothing was prescribed for you, everything was just up to you and your choice. That can feel very empty, in the same way that a I guess, like, you can imagine Minecraft as, there's what creative mode, where it's just a completely flat space that you can do whatever you want with, versus the survival mode where it's randomly generated. Most people choose the survival mode over the creative mode. Some people choose the creative mode, but even the creative mode has preset conditions of, these are the types of blocks you can have or something. So, the human mind is designed by evolution, at the very least, to look at preset conditions, preset rituals, a preset social context, and then it wants to fit in and compete within that social context. So give people back that social context. That's not something that requires really any material resources. I mean, theoretically, you might like to have a church building, or you might like to have robes, or like, you can think of stuff, but at least in the abstract, there's no money that's necessary to do this, which is why something like Jesus, like wearing a simple clothing and like walking through Israel and gathering a huge following, that's why that is something that seems conceivable. And it's why things like that have happened. Like, Hitler was a homeless man who then, became this world leader, right? So things like that can happen, but you need to have rituals, you need to have a metaphysics, you need to have also a passion and a very strong moral compass. Sometimes when I interact with people on the far left, I realize that they have a strong moral compass, even though you would say that it's a perverse moral compass. Like, you might misgender someone, or you might say something like men and women are different. Like, you might not even say it explicitly, but you'll say something like, oh man, you're screaming like a girl, and then they come and correct you. How many of us on the right are willing to correct people for making some kind of egalitarian implicit statement? Like, if someone said like, hey man, let's all be fair, does any one of us say, fairness is an egalitarian construct, like, you're a terrible person? We wouldn't do that, but people on the left will do that because they have this moral fervor to them. They're also backed up by state ideology. But I'm saying that's the kind of direction you want to go in, where you have a moral community, a social community, a spiritual community, and it's all integrated with rituals. That's what needs to be designed. Obviously, it's going to incorporate stuff that's either explicitly or implicitly Christian in a way. It probably makes sense just to say, hey, we're Christians, and then to have a kind of tiered thing where then we also reveal that, like, hey, like, Hindus are not stupid people. There's something to be learned with them. Even you could probably learn something studying Islam. You could learn something studying Judaism. You could learn a lot. And this knowledge, as you've said, it is good to learn things. But if you do not have discernment and you just learn stuff, I mean, what did these leftists learn? They learn about gender fluidity. Well, you could spend hours and hours reading books or papers on gender fluidity, and you would have a lot of knowledge. But if you don't have the discernment to decide what is ultimately true and good, then you've just attained a bunch of knowledge that is now perverse, and that's going to lead you down a bad path. So, like, we can learn about these things, but it does need to be in a tiered system. And originally that was the purpose of like a college or a university, is that you select people from the population who you think might have the potential for discernment, you train that discernment, and then you give them the knowledge. That's kind of why you like teach people Latin. It's not really a practical thing, but you test to see who is good at learning the structure of this language. And then from those people who are good at Latin, you say, then you can be the doctors and you can be the lawyers and you can be the officer class in the military and so on and so forth. And then Scientology is going to be the next major religion of the West. That's funny because I was actually thinking if L. Ron Hubbard just called himself a Christian, how much farther would he have gotten if he said, we're a Christian sect, but we also believe this other stuff? Because that's what the Mormons did, right? Not L. Ron Hubbard, but Joseph Smith was like, hey, we're Christians, guys, but also I wrote these books and you should really read them as well. But I think that's probably the better way to go, is just to say, yeah, we're Christians, but we also believe this other stuff. Like, we're Christians, but we read Schopenhauer and, don't hail Xenu, don't. No, Scientology is pretty, I think it's going down. I think that cult is failing, and it's a failure of leadership, and it's going in a bad direction. But I don't think that the idea of like a guy, I mean, because he uses the Christian cross as a symbol, he does take things from Christianity, and he does talk about stuff that's true. So Scientologists will talk about the layers of identity, starting with the individual, the family, humanity, the universe. They talk about stuff like that. And it's kind of, I don't know if you would call it, like, a lot of it's self-help books, a lot of it's from science fiction. It's taking all these different elements, and you can't look at it and say like this is all false, because they've taken a lot of true stuff from different sources, but then they've added onto it a Ponzi scheme. And yeah, the whole thing where they've meshed themselves into celebrity culture with Tom Cruise was probably not the right way to go, but that is the sinking ship they tied themselves to. And I'm reading some of the comments about Ryan Falk, modern masculinity. Bodybuilding. I mean, I'm not. So Western Man is saying I'm too pessimistic, and that you could take bodybuilding culture and make it into a proto-fascist thing or a forum culture. And I agree. That's kind of what the alt-right is supposed to be. It's supposed to be the creation of a proto-fascist culture, but I think there also has to be, either implicitly or explicitly, there has to be a religious element to that, and that's what people should be driving towards. And that was what the Tula's Gesellschaft was that started the German Workers' Party. It was a religious and spiritual order, and those were the kinds of things that ultimately led to political fascism. It was people who were intellectual, people who were spiritual, people who were working on the groundwork. It wasn't as if they just came in with their memes and were just bros together and then it all worked out from there. There was a lot of deep right work that went into it that needs to be done today.
Anders Haas, there is no objective right and wrong, only consequences. This is why we create law. What are your views? I used to think that, and I think it's a reasonable position. Nihilism kind of at face value makes sense. But consequences are structured in an objective way. They're not subjective altogether. If you do certain things, you will suffer. If you do other things, you will feel pleasure. And so that, structure implies kind of an objective dynamic to what we perceive as moral phenomena. So there's a way to navigate it correctly and a way to navigate it incorrectly. So moral objectivity, I think, has its grounding there, the reality of consequences and the reality of suffering and the reality of pleasure, I guess, if you want to use that, or goodness or happiness or whatever. And how you estimate that depends on your metaphysics, which that's the connection between religion and how you live your life. It's why the same people who tell you what's good to do also tell you how the world came to be, because these are fundamentally connected. We make a moral calculus based on what we know of the world, and so religion tells us what the world is, and then runs that calculus. And there has to be some internal logic to it. Like, in a sense, all moral frameworks, all religious moral frameworks depend on a kind of objectivity or intersubjectivity which recognizes the internal consistency of moral frameworks. We kind of have a meta moral analysis that's brought to bear on any purported objective moral framework. Space-Time is still defending Scientology. Yeah, I don't really expect great things from them, but as far as getting in with Hollywood, I think the Hollywood elite is very different from the Roman elite, and the groundwork was very different. So the Hollywood elite are into like Kabbalism, they're into esoteric stuff, and Scientology, the way he designed it, fits in with those Kabbalistic narratives well enough and fits into that culture. And so yes, it was adopted by them. But the Hollywood types, that is their brainwashing. That's how they're controlled. As opposed to the Roman aristocrats who adopted Christianity, they liked Christianity because it was compatible with Stoicism. Stoicism was the major philosophy of the Roman aristocrats, and that was not an implement of their control, or used to control them. It was them controlling themselves, right, with Stoicism. So I think these are pretty different contexts, but yeah, that Christian element really does seem necessary, given, if you imagine like the political level of the struggle between left and right, the right is Christian, and if you don't at least at face value seem Christian, then you've just lost most of your potential base. Like, the right is the Christian wing and the left is the atheistic wing. If you're not Christian, then you're not going to have that base of support. Which, I don't know, I'm not, inherently a right winger. I used to be around all sorts of leftists. A lot of people have that background. But the reason that I believed in a libertarian distribution of things was because of communitarian and moral instincts that leftists share, although they're not allowed to kind of live up to it. You look at their ideal communities, and they talk about the extended family. They talk about things that do matter and are intrinsic to a natural kind of way of life, natural law. But now it's, with the transgender stuff, with polyamory, with pedophilia, all of that, it's kind of detracting from this element. But I think common sense leftists, maybe Bernie supporters, want to be somewhere where they're sustainable, they're not using excess energy and resources, families are cooperating, and the moral regulation is being done at the local level, and that is what they like. Leftists govern by rallying and shaming. They govern. The reason why they have strong moral intuitions is that they're very good at projecting how others will perceive their actions or the actions of others. So they're kind of a built-in mob. But that's good, right? Because what a Christian message can begin with is criticizing the atomism and individualism and nihilism of modern culture. The errors of the modern world are, there's tons of them. And you don't have to go into the deep metaphysics. You don't have to go into anything except calling out what is clearly unhealthy. Like, that's why Jesus' message spread, was that he was there to heal the sick. And that's the message. People are sick, and we know a way that they can find health. And we know the resources that they can go to attain that. So, that's... I don't think the leftists that are communitarian at heart are lost causes, because they do want community, they do want organic lifestyles, and if the message that you preach is compatible with that, I think there's a way to bridge that gap. And I guess polling has suggested that millennials, at least millennial men, have turned conservative to a large degree. I don't know, it remains to be seen how the people in their 20s and early 30s today will develop. But yeah, that's the end of my thought there.
Yeah, I'm not haven't looked at the polling recently. I was really into it during the election and all the different things that they're pointing out. I mean, there's definitely white men who are not going to college are very conservative, and it's drastic given the historical demography of the country, right? At one point, we lived in a country where only white men could vote. And so, given that, if you had, I mean, we're talking about 70, 80, perhaps even 90% support for the Republican Party among this demographic. Had you had that kind of support for a political party in the past, what would have happened is that political party would split off into two political parties. It would speciate, because that's what happens when something is really successful and it dominates and it creates hegemony. Then usually that results in speciation. So typically you would have, I mean, let us imagine for a moment that only white men could vote. Then you would probably have a right wing and a left wing of the Republican Party as it is today. So maybe you would have someone slightly to the left of Trump, maybe like who was the guy who ran for the Democrats who has an Asian wife? He was a Vietnam veteran and he's Scots Irish. I forget his name, but you would have kind of like a working class white Democrat type guy. Like, yeah, I'm for the working class, but also we need conservative Christian values. And then you would have, or like a kind of more of a right wing Christian Bernie Sanders type. And then on the other hand, you would probably have more like a hardcore Trump, maybe with some more libertarian economic, like some Ron Paul economics thrown in, or just a more radical Trump, a Trump who would say the things that he says, and then he would just go farther with them. You know, go into more like a Gav McInnes, like an alt-right or alt-light direction, I should say, where you are just a little bit more extreme with it. So it wouldn't be a total departure from who he is, but that is what would happen. And so in a way, I can look at this demographic of people, the white male, not college educated, of a certain age, between 20 and 40, let's say. And this is in some senses, a very politically united demographic, and it's more politically united than it's ever been before in American history, which is very strange to think about it that way, because of course we think about the country as being very fragmented. Now, how could that political unity translate? How could we use that unity to great effects? Like what could we do with it? And that's why I think we have to start thinking in a more religious direction, because these guys, they basically agree politically. Like they're like, hey, leave me alone, build the wall, just improve the economy, more jobs, whatever. They have a pretty simple platform, but that needs to be harnessed and taken advantage of, because right now it's just a dormant potential. The alt-right and the Charlottesville rally was an attempt to make use of that dormant potential. I think it was a waste of the potential, but there's something that can be done. And for me, I don't think it's going to be like we're going to do one big rally or we're going to have one big election. It's got to be more like every weekend you get together and you talk. And as you talk, you figure out a way to ritualize your life. And if that mixes in with bodybuilding culture, great. If that mixes in with health culture, like the way that we eat, our organic farming in your backyard, or just like changing your diet. And that's why I think veganism, I'm not a vegan, but I think it's an interesting subculture to look at, because you're eating intentionally, and you're reading the ingredients and the labels, and you're realizing the forces that are kind of against you in this world as a vegan. And I think it does create a more intentional person, a more conscientious person. So I still eat meat, but I appreciate those values that are expressed in the vegan community, that they care about what they put in their body. And I think we need to start reaching out to these people, this demographic of the high school graduates, young white men, and start like pulling them in a direction of like, hey, your life matters. People care about you. People want you to exist. You are not just, you're not just a plumber or an electrician or whatever you are. You're part of a community, and we want you to join us, and give them something that's digestible and understandable, and give them something that they don't need to dox themselves or go get beaten up by Antifa. Because like, I get the whole thing about like fascism and self-sacrifice, but we need to be a little more disciplined in our self-sacrifice, less berserker rage, and a little more Protestant work ethic, maybe. Or I just think of like the farming classes where you just go out on the fields every day at 5 o'clock in the morning and you work. That's the kind of ethic that is necessary. That is the kind of self-sacrifice that actually builds up civilized communities, rather than like, we're gonna pull a big prank in Minecraft or do something like that, is not really the way to build something. It's an expression of emotion, it's an expression of anger, but those destructive energies need to be reeled back and harnessed for something creative and productive. So, I mean, that's part of the reason why I struggle through technical difficulties without minding it, because this is part of what I'm putting forward as a model in order to do this work. Is you get together, whether it's in a physical or virtual space, and you try to hash these things out, and you try to come to a more clear worldview. And I see there's someone in the chat, caring support group, political parties. You don't need to be a vegan. I can't stand vegans. Give them digestible meat. Yeah, there's a huge problem with meat being full of estrogens and growth hormone and all of that kind of stuff. So you have to watch out. My other diet advice for the day is phytic acid. Stop eating beans and legumes. They're full of anti-nutrients. So I've been meaning to do some kind of health video, diet advice, because I think that kind of thing, that's what I mean when I talk about religion, is that you have to have a holistic approach towards life and community. That, that's why you go to communion and you eat the bread and you drink the wine, because that is just a basic part of being a human being. We have to integrate all of that together, the way that we dress, the way that we eat, the way that we spend our free time, what our leisure activities are, what our pleasure, like all of this has to come together, the mundane things that we do and our high ideals, they have to somehow be connected to one another, because otherwise you're taking people out of their natural psychological environment, and they're wasting their potential trying to figure out how to structure their lives, when what they really need is just someone to structure their lives for them. Essentially, that's what church used to do. That's
peer pressure.
Yeah, absolutely.
You don't sell it to people like, we're going to tell you how to live. You show them an example of what life could be, and then put them in a peer context where they want to seek out those same things. But at the same time, like, it is kind of, we're going to tell you how to live, because some people know diet better than others. Some people understand, how to exercise. Some people understand how to maintain a home. And some people understand basic philosophy and all of these things better than others. And if you don't find a mechanism to capitalize on our relative advantages and distribute authority, teaching authority to the people who are expert in certain things, then you won't, like, just the person who may be very good with some kind of political philosophy or economic philosophy, at the same time won't be having the best diet, because they're not in a peer context where that popular knowledge, folk wisdom is developed and distributed to them. In lieu of that, what do they have? If there's someone who's an autodidact, they're going on and they're learning themselves, and maybe they make very informed decisions on a regular basis. But without a peer context that's organized by a notion of authority coming from expertise, and that expertise has to be recognized, there has to be a mechanism for recognizing expertise. Lacking that, people just don't live as efficiently as they otherwise would. Napoleon Hill in Think and Grow Rich, which is probably an evil book, but I mean a lot of people who are successful have read it, he talks about the importance of having a mastermind group, is the term I think that he uses for it, which is like 5 or 6 people that you talk to on a weekly basis. And this is basically using the collective processing power of a small group in natural conversation to make better decisions for everyone. And I mean, imagine if you talked to somebody every week that maybe had a slightly higher IQ, and maybe you talked to someone who had a lower IQ, and just kind of reviewed the plans for the week. Like, I talk to the guy who's above me, and I say, like, this is how I plan on spending my time this week. What do you think of it? And then he gives his comments, his feedback, and I make choices based on that. And then the following week, I say, well, this is what I actually ended up doing. And the person above me can say, like, well, you really didn't live up to this. And even just without any enforcement mechanism beyond this, the fact that you're talking about your own shortcomings means that you're more likely to change them, because now you have feedback, now you have peer pressure, now you have some higher authority than yourself, or at least you psychologize it as a higher authority. Naturally, you will. It's going to provide a countervalence to your own laziness. People are lazy. I'm lazy by nature. If I can be happy and just do the things I want to do, maybe read occasionally because I have intellectual demands, but then maybe I do want to play a video game, right? Maybe I want to play Star Fox, and I do, and I did the other night, which is why I say that. And that's something that, you know, that's a slippery slope that you go down. If you just want to do what you enjoy, it's very unlikely that you're going to do the things that lead to productivity. And that means your group isn't going to win. Like, why is China so powerful? Because they organize their labor efficiently. They have very authoritarian mechanisms for doing it. Why is Switzerland effective? Because they're high IQ relatively for European peoples. They're high trust. And they have a history of mediating conflict backed up by a legitimate threat of violence. And this is a social context that evolved, but it's a social context. Like that peer pressure element was there. It wasn't as authoritative. Those are the kind of 2 examples I could think of a hyper-authoritarian effective use of resources, and then a relatively libertarian, I guess you could say, use of resources. And Switzerland really does reflect what I used to think of as an ideal model, where you give cantons, you give regions their independence, and they can formulate how they structure things under the aegis of some higher authority as well, but that higher authority is more or less hands-off. So these are the 2 extremes of conceptions of how to redistribute the executive function. A church can do this, right? And you can provide a positive incentive for people to move up and provide more of the executive role, and then provide a disincentive not to fulfill your role. And it's all just a matter of writing out plans and you know, setting up, most importantly, setting up persistent communications, and incentivizing people to maintain it, and disincentivizing people to ignore it. So, I mean, this could start with just a weekly meeting. That's probably how it does have to start with, you know, what it does have to start with. But the goal is you have to have a metaphysic. You have to get deep into philosophy. You have to arrive at consensus in order to arrive at ethical consensus. This is just the way it is. If you don't have that ethical consensus strictly philosophically defined, then what you have really is a political coalition. You have a coalition of political actors that act in a perceived common interest that will degrade over time. And the alt-right is this. It's people who more or less want the same kind of outcome, but they don't have metaphysical consensus. They don't have a common worldview. It's not philosophical. And it degraded in like a year. it degraded so fast, despite being massive in the political scene compared to like other fringe developments. RJ, hey Eric, what do you think of accelerationism? Accelerationism, I don't believe in because I think we need time. I don't think it helps us for society to collapse today because I wouldn't be prepared, right? I wouldn't have recourse to community that's already built. I wouldn't have land out in the country with a bunker. I wouldn't have what you'd need. When society collapses, it's going to be so brutal that you can't even imagine it. Right? We don't know what it would be like. And I do think that that's a likely outcome. It might not happen, but accelerationism is the idea that we push it to that point. It's going to be so bloody. If you want accelerationism, you also ought to want communities of several hundred people out in the middle of nowhere with bunkers, build a freaking castle, go somewhere with no building codes and build a massive fortress, and then have your own land and have a guaranteed food supply, water purification, generators, solar generators, everything that you could possibly have to defend yourself from hordes of migrating, underclass, because that's what you would need. Now, at a certain level, strategically, do I think that's probably the right move? Not to cause it now, but to prepare for that eventuality? Yes. And I think that you can market to leftists, Bernie bro types, by advocating the socialist element of that. It's about community. It's about society, forming organic, sustainable society. And that means defensible. Sustainable means you aren't reliant on the system. That's what sustainability is. So there's a very right-wing reason to favor the left-wing ethos of the kind of green movement. And then just as an aside, as for veganism, vegetarianism, it is better ethically, I think, overall, to be vegetarian. There are arguments that it can be a healthy diet, but I think for men it's probably better, yes, to have some meat to build protein, to get a good supply of iron. Like if you are obsessive with certain supplements, you can be healthy on that kind of diet. It shouldn't be discouraged. And maybe women should be that way more than others, which we talked about last time. Herman Salza, but will you ever really be prepared enough? I don't think it will be an all-out collapse, but more of a balkanization. Yeah, we don't know. I mean, what if we run out of oil? What if the trucks can't run and supplies aren't moving and people start starving? Or what if there's a massive electronic attack on the power system? What if because the global system is so entangled, what if it's a mass economic depression combined with like an oil shortage and energy outages, and this is just planet-wide? We really haven't experimented with these kinds of systems. We've seen societies collapse before. Argentina had a kind of societal collapse in the early 2000s, and it wasn't complete anarchy. Crime went way up, and it would go way up. But yeah, food becomes more expensive. People do starve in those contexts. But when you have the dependence on moving this food supply around like we do in America, like most countries around the world have less centralized food, or rather agricultural systems than we do. With us, like the food is grown in one kind of place, owned by very few people, and then distributed to everybody else via trucks. And trucks run America. If you didn't have trucks, you wouldn't have society. And if we run real low on oil, right? If oil becomes so expensive, there's so many scenarios where it could happen. But if you want to think Machiavellian for a second, if you want to believe in the accelerationism model, like, given that a slow, steady trend will be toward the browning of America, the increasing hedonism of America, the going away from God of America, if you want to avoid that and slow growth, political opposition doesn't seem feasible, what would you want to do? Well, you would want to prepare for societal collapse and then lead to it and contribute to it. And that is what I don't know if American Revolution can really be framed in this sense. I guess not. But this is what revolutionary movements should do. Form a government within a government, have contingencies in place for when systems fail, and then cause them to fail. And because you're prepared, because you know what systems are going to fail, you're in a better position. Of course, that's all theoretical. This is all abstract political philosophy. I would never actually advocate any of it, but that would be the argument, I think, for accelerationism. But you'd have to prepare for it first. Kremlin Bot 88. Either the food supply or electricity need to be significantly disrupted for the malaise of comfort to kick things into action. Yeah, it's very hard to have revolutionaries when people are still well fed and when they have the internet. But luckily, if you want to look at it that way, these things can be disrupted relatively easily. Kurt Doolittle talks about that a lot. So it looks like you were chatting with people. Ken, anything you'd like to comment on?
Yeah, I don't think that's correct. I mean, when I look into the logistics of how do we protect our systems of civilization from terror, I see a lot of I see two things. First of all, I see redundancy in the infrastructure, which prevents bad things from happening. But then on top of that, I see that the people who are best suited to survive a civilizational collapse are not like the 70-year-old prepper living, in his compound somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. That's not really the best positioned person. The best positioned people are actually the elites that all of these so-called preppers hate. They have all the money. They have actual bunkers with actual deep thermoelectric systems that are going to keep them alive for millions of years or something. Like, they have all of this set up and you don't know about it because you don't need to know about it. But obviously, we know enough to know that these things do exist, and that if there is a nuclear winter, the only people who will survive will be these elites. And that's what Alex Jones says. He says that basically the elites are just trying to get all their ducks in a row so that they can collapse the population. And I think the peaceful collapse is they do it through psychological sterilization, that they make men into women, women into men, we stop reproducing, and then they just phase us out. That's the peaceful solution. They could also come up with a bioweapon and just inject themselves with the vaccine and let everyone else die. So basically, if 99% of people died, the people who survived would mostly be Jewish, Brahmins, billionaires. These are the people who would be left. So I don't really advocate any kind of total collapse Mad Max scenario, because I think that would benefit people that are not watching or enjoying this stream. And I don't think that will happen. And maybe that's just wishful thinking on my part, because again, I'm not prepared. Mark Zuckerberg is prepared. Bill Gates is prepared, but I'm not prepared. So I hope things don't collapse, and I don't think things will collapse. And I think things will just become like ancient India or modern day Brazil, where you have a lot of different kinds of people. It doesn't work all that well. I mean, the amount of public defecation in India is staggering. If you look at the average IQ of India is not, in theoretical terms, you look at the resources of India, you look at the population, you look at the average intelligence, it should not have the rates of public defecation that it does. And yet you still have this, in many ways, highly dysfunctional society. On the other hand, you have a ton of Brahmins who are extremely intelligent, who are then coming to the West and out-competing white people. So, it's a highly diverse society, and you can't pick that apart. And I think if you went into India and you did a local collapse of civilization, I don't think that would necessarily improve the situation of India. I mean, you could conceive of a situation in which only the Brahmins survive or something like that. And I think that is kind of what the globalists are going for. And I think if you want, here's the ultimate red pill on prepping. Let me red prep you. If you want to survive the collapse of civilization, figure out a way to infiltrate the globalists. Become a globalist, get billions of dollars, and get a seat in the thermonuclear shelter, and that is how you survive, and that's how your genetics survive. If you want to be the loser in that game, go out in the woods and like go into your basement and put a bunch of canned food in there. That is the loser strategy. The winner strategy was to get like billions of dollars, or to become part of Hollywood or something like that.
Yeah.
So,
well, I think
there's a lot of other people commenting as well.
I question the legitimacy of that. Just that Kurt talks about not just kind of prepping in the woods. He talks about what you would have to do to destabilize a system. It is possible, maybe not necessarily likely, but it is possible. And the infrastructure to hit, we know what you would hit, and revolutions have been carried out, organized by us, organized by the CIA mostly. They know the steps to take. Kurt himself knows the steps to take. This is a viable path for those who want to go down it. I mean, there's a lot of risk, but if all other options are closed off, I mean, that's just the way you would go. And prepping, I don't think that they're prepared for networks of prepped communities. And if you could have a religious structure that builds this, maybe not as its primary function, maybe at face value, why you want this network of sustainable communities is because it's just a better way of life. And it's like the Amish. Like, this is the ethical way to live. This is an alternative to modernity. You say this is why it's good. And maybe you can even not make a profit, because it wouldn't be a business exactly, but, be able to scale the model if you do it right. They wouldn't be prepared, the elites wouldn't be prepared to have a network of organized groups like that who, in the event of a crisis, might actually target them in an active sense. And there's also, I don't know. I don't think we can just write that off as a possibility. Just my opinion there. And Indians are outcompeting white people. Kremlin bought 88, and I'm not sure if Indians are outcompeting. They work for nothing and are comfortable living 14 to a 2-bed house. Yeah, they have the highest average income. The average income for an Indian family is like $80,000. And they own a lot of businesses. I don't know. Mr. Cool Mug, every other elite in ancient civilizations have been overthrown. Why should we believe the elites of today will escape? Masses survive. I don't think this is true. Masses are bred out of existence by elites, right? The elites spread their genes more than the masses, and the elites replace the masses over time. This is kind of what happened with the Neolithic. This is what has happened with the history of civilization. Higher income groups in society outbreed lower income groups. And I don't know that every other elite has actually been overthrown. The Roman elite was never overthrown. They persisted, just they didn't have the same kind of monopoly that they did before. But it's the same thing as like the Anglo-American elite, the WASP elite in this country. They're still in power. I mean, many of the billionaires are still WASPs. Maybe they're not actually Protestant, but they just the elite mass kind of transforms in its identity. They don't care about identity in the way that nationalists care about identity. They care about the integrity of the power structure, and the power structures always live on. The Roman power structure, even with the collapse of the Roman Empire, that power structure lived on. And the aristocrats, the landed aristocrats, became feudal lords in many cases. And yeah, the Germans came in and killed some of the ruling class and replaced them. Not all, but much of it. But even in those cases, like the power structure itself, the elite system continued. Now, as far as like the ruling Jewish caste, were they ever overthrown? I don't think so. My hypothesis is that there is an archaic tradition of elites that has persisted, and I'm questioning that presupposition. The elites today, if they caused a mass extinction event, or even if they suppressed underclass reproduction for long enough, they would just be the humanity, what was left of it. And I don't think the masses are guaranteed to survive. Oil is a big issue. When we run out of oil, there's just no telling what the economic system is going to be. And I think Mr. Coolmug, or who was it, that posted like things are going to change. Yeah, it was Western Man. Big changes are coming anyway because of automation and 3D printing. And you just have to look at it like when they don't need labor, when you can't go and, when the market for jobs that you don't need advanced degrees for, it gets small enough, people won't be paid. They just simply won't make enough money just to live. In order to keep those people alive, you're going to need social service programs, basic incomes, things like that. And you won't have access to land at that point. You'll be stuck in an apartment in a city with no alternative. You won't be able to go off the grid at that point. I think we're looking at a window of like 20 years, honestly, when you could still viably become a landed aristocrat. That's the model. I mean, it's a rent-based economy by and large. There are a very limited number of landowners, people who own buildings, who own farmland, who own the what am I looking for? Factories, and other people who rent it. And that class is converging on the feudal model. That's basically, I think, what will happen. And you can currently get into this. Now, as an individual, it's very difficult, but as a group, as a religion, you can have monasteries, you can have land. The Catholic Church owns all this land all over the world. That is possible. And you can even reproduce many of the eugenic factors that led to the European peoples as we know them, like manorialism, where the church owns all this land. Well, in the past it was the feudal lords, but in this context, the church owns all this land, and it needs tenants, and there are stipulations you have to meet to be a tenant on the land and to have your housing costs eliminated, essentially, and to live in a good environment. And that can be based on tests. That can be based, like in a manorial system, on having a wife, having children, prove that you're reproducing and adding value and growing the church. And that's definitely a possibility that would avoid many of the downfalls that we're going to see because of automation, because of AI. The importance of the worker is being downgraded, and the importance of the landowner is actually being upgraded. So what to do now? Own land, own institutions, because the value of land is never going to go away. Like, that's a scarce commodity that we can simply own if we put our minds to it and organize. As an individual, you can't own much. I own a little bit, a tiny bit, and it's not much. But that's what an individual income can achieve today. Caring support group. Farmers are going out of business left and right in America. The average age of farmers in America is like 60. Yeah, the business model of the small family farm cannot compete currently with industrialized agriculture, but when oil gets scarcer, that might not necessarily be the case. And as actually you can use automation in like this example, if you have a small farm and you have automated equipment, then maybe you don't need the kind of resources. Like, yeah, it's still an additional investment, but with 3D printing, with all of this stuff, maybe it's a case where there's no more barrier to entry for some of this technology. And if political support can be given to green movements and people who want to ban GMOs and ban pesticides and stuff like that, that would take a big bite out of big agro. And so I don't know. I think there is a way to challenge the centralization of food in this country, but it has to start with owning those resources. There's simply no alternative. There's really not. Tuoth, I have not been watching Varg. Maybe he does talk about the collapse of civilization after oil runs out. I'm not saying it will happen, but it could. Civilization will become more fragile. There's all sorts of opportunities for things to collapse. I'm a believer in sovereignty. I'm a believer in planning your future and putting yourself in the driver's seat for your future, not just depending on the system as it exists. If the system's evil, build a better system. Build a redundant system. Build a sustainable system. Why are you at the mercy of the people you hate? Why are you at the mercy of the people you hate? It does not make sense. It's not a way to live. And church can proselytize that message. Yeah. Anders Haas oil is not running out in the next 150 years. I don't know about that. I mean, last year was the lowest discovery of oil in history, and the rate of new discoveries is going down. The costs, like, I think with what is it called? Shale oil, we have new technologies to access new reserves, and American production has gone way up. But we don't even have companies that are willing to invest in the refineries that we need to process shale. And so I don't think the economic situation looks like we are 150 years away from peak oil. I mean, maybe, yeah, we don't run out for 150 years, but the days when processing a barrel of oil is a matter of $20, those days may be very short, right? It may be that it becomes much more expensive very shortly. Yeah, I think Varg is kind of right in that his whole way of life is preparing for that possibility. But I don't think he's right in not organizing more with a larger group. But yeah, maybe like the prepper stuff is the logical implication, or the final extrapolation of this way of thinking. Like, you have to prepare for being a civilization, being a community, if everything else fails. Like, that's the ultimate conclusion. But in the short term, I think we've kind of gone out on a long branch, whereas the short term, what you're really worried about is what an ethno-religion looks like, how to organize it, how to begin it, because this is all like what happens when the world ends. But it's easy to have those conversations, so I see why it leads there. Ken?
Yeah, I've been agreeing with Anders Haas. I used to be into the peak oil stuff, and then I saw how the people promoting peak oil were the same people promoting global warming, and then I started to look into that, and it's politicized. It's coming at it from, oh wow, there's this apocalypse coming from, so join my cult. I mean, it's a classic move. I don't think any of that's happening. I agree that when self-driving cars become more normal than like human operated vehicles, I think that will put a huge number of people out of business. I don't think people understand the consequences of that. That is going to really change our economy. You're going to have people like the way we think about, I think it was Romney said something like 47% of people are taxpayers or not tax. Anyway, he was basically saying that half of the people in the country are parasites. That number is going to double or triple or quadruple essentially when these machines take over people's jobs. We have to remember that originally in a feudal society, everyone would be an agriculturalist except for a small number of people. And that's a job that, of course, you know, in the American slave trade, that's what the slaves were doing, was agriculturalism. So this, sorry, I'm distracted by the names of popes. The fact that technology is taking over these jobs makes a large number of people obsolete in the fact that their either environment or their genetics is not shaping up for the tasks that remain employable work as employable careers. So either these people are going to exist as parasites, or they are going to voluntarily exit the gene pool, or they are going to be attacked by some kind of elite that wants to get rid of them. So it kind of remains to be seen, but I think that is the cataclysmic event coming. It's not going to be we run out of resources and then it's Mad Max. It's going to be we advance technologically to the point that a lot of people no longer really have a purpose in life. And then what is going to happen to those people? What are they going to do? And what is going to be done about them by the ruling elite? I think that is really the big cataclysmic event coming. And on the last names of popes, so if you look at the popes during the popes and anti-popes, and you look at the contest between them, and you just look up like Pope Gregory the 7th or something. You look at who he was, what family did he come from, and how did this family identify? They identified as the descendants of the old Roman aristocracy. So maybe they were just making that up, but there were still people calling themselves Romans in Byzantium, who we do have the lineage for, who were descended from Romans up until the 15th century. So I don't think it's David Icke to say that there was a Roman aristocracy. They converted to Christianity. They had the power. They became the bishops. They founded these families. Yeah, it's not David. That's just like mainstream historian stuff. So I'm not saying they all had the same last name. I'm saying that there were many senatorial tribes or clans, families in ancient Rome, that they didn't get wiped out by the Germans, that they continued to exist. Actually, the Germanic invasion of Italy, like the sacking of Rome, is exaggerated because of how we retrospectively look at the collapse of that civilization. But in reality, it was fairly nonviolent on the whole, and it was very cooperative. Like there was a lot of cooperation between the old aristocracy and the new Germans, and there was a kind of reverse assimilation. You see this happening a lot with Germanic invaders. They'll go into France as the Normans, and then they start speaking French, or they go into Italy as the Visigoths or something, and then they end up speaking Italian. They go into Russia as the Rus, and then they start speaking Russian. So this is okay. So you're saying it's tenuous. Again, we're talking about family.
So I'm not sure what's happening there. We'll wait for Ken's picture to catch back up, because it's lagging pretty bad. I hope it's not just me. In the chat, let us know what it's actually sounding like. Yeah, it's lagging very bad. So in the chat, let me know if I'm lagging, if you can hear me. Yeah, he's becoming a robot. Yeah. What about me? Is it just Ken, or is it me too? Am I also lagging?
Or just on my.
Okay, so they can hear me. Yeah, there he goes. All right. So I was not lagging. He was. He's going to come back in. I just had one comment in the meantime. Anders Haas says global warming is a scam. Global warming is good for our side to argue, because it's anti-global elite. You have to say you don't need the global elite to, save the environment. You need a new way of life, because this industrial society, the Kaczynski argument, this industrial society is not good for the individual. It's not good for the environment. That's a justification. That's a moral justification that you can use. I think it's a lot. You gain a lot more sympathy by saying that I'm worried about the future of the environment. I'm worried about finite resources. I'm worried about the ecosystem than you do vice versa. And even if global warming was completely untrue, now first of all, I think that the globe is going to get warmer. We're still in an ice age. The long trend says it should get older. The kind of seismic, history. Yeah. So wait, let's see if Ken. But anyway, the history says it should get warmer, and what we're doing likely is not helping. And so I don't know. Maybe global warming is used for bad things, but jujitsu, or rather like taekwondo instead of boxing, don't just punch back. Use the momentum and throw them with it, right? The elites have pushed this message, but it's a message that is not something that should build sympathy for them. It should build sympathy for someone who wants to build a sustainable alternative. that's back to the land, that's resilient, that is not dependent on these globalist supply chains that go for thousands of miles and cross cultural boundaries. Like the traditionalist way of life is, I think, supported by the notion of global warming. Yeah. Herman Salza says yes, but the globalists, have pushed that because they say they needed to take control of the environment. Well, that might be true. Someone might need to take control of the environment. So if you can use that to justify your own brand of globalism, then use that. And I'm not. Maybe it is the case that some global entity does need to prevent massive environmental degradation. If you have like China start drilling off the coast or in international waters and massive oil spills, like these things could happen, and who cleans it up? Who takes care of the environment? When nations themselves are the aggressors in these instances, you need global institutions for stuff like that. That's my opinion. I think they're actually right. I think in a lot of respects the globalists are right. It's a fine line, I think, where I actually disagree with them. Probably it's because they don't agree with organic community, this whole education and environmental obsession that started with the socialists in the 1800s, or actually maybe it does go back to the actual Enlightenment itself. But so Ken, are you a robot still, or what's up?
I don't think I'm a robot. Do I sound like a robot?
Not now. You did.
Oh, cool. Oh well, yeah. I think my Wi-Fi was acting badly, but I'm returned to my human form. Uh, yeah, I understand like why people are into environmentalism, and again, it's like the veganism thing. I appreciate that people care about the earth and they're worried about the earth and stuff because it shows that they are not myopic in their perspective and their priorities are they're at the highest. They're trying to stretch toward this highest level of reality where they're not just thinking about my own particular situation, but they're thinking about the entire world. So I appreciate it, but I think it is used and abused. It is manipulated. Narratives are set up, and that is why CO2 is attacked, but we still have a plastic economy. One of the worst things that we can be doing for ourselves as people living in an environment is to have an economy where every food that we have is put into plastic, plastic that contains all of these xenoestrogens, plastic that's probably causing a lot of cancer. But I think the immediate concern for most people is it is changing our behavior. It's making us more docile. It's causing, mental diseases. It's really not a good thing. It's taking us away from our health. It's part of the reason why people are. It's part of the reason why we're going in a more and more obese direction. But when you think about it, we could replace plastic with glass. There's a lot of things that we could put our food in, and it would make it a couple dollars more expensive. But the question is, what is your priority? And this is my problem when veganism goes into like a political sphere rather than a health-based sphere. They start saying like, well, if we converted everyone, and I think we talked about this last time as well, if we converted everyone to veganism, then we could have 50 billion people living on the planet or something like that. But again, it's quantity versus quality. I don't want just a large number of people living on the planet. Now, that is, I think, part of the globalist plan is that they want to increase the population because they've made this calculation that if you simply have a billion people, then there's going to be a certain number of geniuses that arise out of that billion people. And so it's this brute force method of solving problems is just, we're going to create a bunch of people. Some of these people are going to be super smart, And then from those super smart people, we'll draw we'll recruit them into our fold, and then we'll like construct this utopia or something like that. Which, yeah, I'm more of a quality versus quantity guy. I would rather have, let's make things a little more expensive. Let's maybe have a few less people. Let's, pay more for food, but it's less poisonous. Like, let's have a smaller number of people, but a better quality of people versus just flooding the world with as many people as possible, making every square inch of the earth into an urban center, and then drawing out of that, billions and billions of people. Some of them will be high quality individuals. Some of them will be very intelligent. And it's basically an economic model. It's not a strictly communist or capitalist model, but it's the mass economy where you have just a sheer volume of people. You could almost talk about it in terms of RK selection, where you just have a huge number of people, and then some of them are just going to turn out. It's like the monkeys on the typewriter writing Shakespeare, right? Some of them are going to turn out to be very adept thinkers, and you can then use those people, and what happens to the rest of them, well, who cares? Now, it's obviously a lot more appealing to me to have a smaller number of people who are doing well. Like, to put it in fantasy terms, you've got the elves, where everyone is expected to be perfect, but it's a very slow, methodical culture, versus the orcs, where everyone is kind of disposable, and then out of that horde, you kind of get elites like Sauron, you get elites like the Uruk-hai or something like that. So the idea of a homogeneous culture where everyone is set to a very high standard versus this general, like, it is a Brazil model, it is a India model, where you just have a very heterogeneous population where some people are untouchable, some people are worthless, and then some people are very valuable. It is a difference of a genetic model, and the question is, are you going to buy into it as it is, or are you going to try to get into the life raft? And I don't think of it in terms of environmental disasters. I think of it in terms of social disasters, that we are being flooded psychologically, not physically. Like, we have the potential and the resources with the welfare state to have many, many kids. We don't want to do that because of our psychological and moral objections. So, we look at our ancestors and see that they had higher birth rates, but they had less material access to resources in certain ways. So it's really more about, we are being hit with moral and psychological and social weapons. We're being isolated. We're being put into captivity. We're being domesticated. So how do you get out of that psychological space? How do you enter into a new psychological space? And some of that could be material. Some of it could be going out and living in the country. I think that is what the blood and soil ideology originally was. It said urbanism is a domesticating force. It destroys people psychologically. You need to get them back into the soil in order to promote good blood. And what good blood meant was not a static blood. It meant that being in the soil allows the best people to reproduce and the worst people to not reproduce. Whereas being in the urban jungle actually takes the best people and it makes them infertile, and it takes the worst people and it makes them fertile. So that is what the blood and soil ideology meant. It was recognized in the 1920s and even earlier in the 19th century. Even like early socialists like Frederick Engels, they were going into these crowded tenement housing and they're like, this is not a good situation. So it's been recognized for a long time. This is something that should, I mean, it's a worthy goal. It's a problematic goal though, because once you get into that, then you leave all these people behind. That the Amish are doing it. They're in the soil, but there are so many people who are left behind. And that's kind of what I see as the goal, or the struggle, is to take all of these people who are in this urban environment or this internet environment, and they're looking for something natural. And how do you get people from point A to point B? How do you get people from 4chan to the Amish commune? There's got to be some kind of pipeline there, because people do want it. But how do you make it realistic? How do you jump that gap? People will meme about it. So there is some kind of potential there, but you have to create something where people feel comfortable enough to take the risks. I think some of it is like there's a weird kind of anxiety where, I don't know if it's a Stockholm syndrome, but people become so familiar with their current context that they can't, even though they know the life they live is evil, they cannot leave that life because it's the one that's familiar to them. They can't, do something good. Whether it's people who don't exercise, they're like afraid of exercising, or exercise is painful for them. Same thing with social awkwardness. People are afraid to socialize. People are afraid to go to the church. So all of that, the question for me is, how do you break down those fears and anxieties so that people can start to transition from self-destructive lives into productive lives?
Right. Someone said something, Mr. Coolmug, the only way to change the psychological space is to create a better narrative. And I think part of creating a better narrative is creating a better communication space. So we don't have a great psychological space. A way to correct this is alternative peer groupings. So we need persistent communications networks, which have evolved organically on image boards, on in the comment sections. Like, there are actual persistent relationships on YouTube with people saying, being commenters on various channels. And then Discord is a newer kind of innovation, and these sorts of things. But all of that, you have to have an incentive to keep going. And in the media-driven platform, the incentive is fame. And I don't think that's a great incentive, so something has to kind of be engineered to incentivize people to maintain relationships with people online. And then that's how you build a narrative. You reach consensus on metaphysical issues. And we say metaphysics a lot, but ultimately that's what you have to get down to, the fundamental questions. A lot of people aren't interested in talking about it, which, not everyone can, but then you have to have a group of people who are able to talk about the highest level concepts, and then below that, some people who are able to talk about the highest level political concepts, maybe looking at political theory in the context of resource scarcity, which you may or may not believe in the context of technological developments, projections. And then you have people who are able to talk about the political narrative at like a metapolitical, ideological level, which I think is not as high order as its context kind of geostrategically in the actual map of the world as it is. And then just kind of going down the chain. But a communications framework looks like you have to talk to this group, you have to talk to this individual weekly, you have to talk to them at this time, and you have to accomplish these objectives. That's how military organization is structured. You have scheduled meetings with people where you achieve deliberate objectives. Again, Think and Grow Rich, Napoleon Hill, he talks about one of the things that gets people from having ideas to actually building companies is time management. People have bad time management by default, and we need better peer groups to form better narratives, also to organize our own time in a better way. That makes us more productive as a group, and it allows us to distribute our time cooperatively so that we're achieving these higher order objectives that are deliberated on by people with high level abstraction abilities, which is not exactly the same as high IQ, but it's closely related. Sam Ludwig doesn't want us to become Brazil. it'd be nice maybe if we could prevent it, but it may be that the trajectory is such that it just cannot be done, apart from absolute civil unrest and chaos and war, revolutionary war, effectively. Maybe that's the only way at this point. But once it does become Brazil, like, maybe you can come back. Maybe there's a way with a coherent religious structure to allow white communities to breed back into existence the white majority over time. But I mean, if we are past that point of no return where America is going to be non-majority white in 50 years, I mean, I guess people born today are less than 50% white. So it seems like just a matter of time, we should hit that point. If you can't accept that, then you can't plan for that. Basically, it's reality denial, and it's not a way to do politics, I think. Yeah. So, Sam Ludwig, why does it have to be a commune? Communes always fail. Communes don't always fail. Communes are colonies, and colonies sometimes succeed. This country was founded as colonies, not as communes in the sense that we think of them today, where you have collective ownership and things. Some of the early colonies were started as communes, and many of them did fail, which is why you had private enterprise and private land ownership being adopted by the successful ones. But, you know, the idea of a colony, of going out and starting a new way of life with its own charter, with its own constitution, that's very normal. That's the way things go. And it does not have to be a commune in the sense that you're probably thinking of it. But there is this issue where if you go into a small town, everyone has to have the capital to buy buildings in a small town. Small towns, cheap small towns, you're probably not going to be able to finance those properties. You can't get traditional mortgages on old farmhouses that are falling apart. You either have to have cash in hand or, well, actually, no, that's your only option. So, you know, to make that work in a small town legally is just very difficult, financially very difficult, because you're going to have discrimination lawsuits, whereas a religious commune, being religious, is immune to many of those anti-discrimination laws, and there are ways of getting around the financial issue, because buying 1,000 acres is much cheaper per acre than buying 10, and building structures and paying your own people, subsidizing your own people effectively to build houses is cheaper than buying houses used or new. So there are advantages, but even then, collective ownership, communes don't always fail. You just have to have good incentive structures. People don't care about ownership per se. They care about social capital. And if you have good social capital-based incentive structures, people will work. Like Oneida is a classical example of an American collective ownership commune that was very successful and expanded into a major business. People, so I see some messages addressed to me from Mr. Coolmug. Achieving objectives and putting out white pills is necessary for any physical movement. I agree. Yeah, but it's not just putting out white pills. It's like persistent communications and giving up freedom. That's it. If you want to be successful, you have to give up some leisure time. You have to give up some freedom. And you have to do what people tell you to, who are within your chain of command. The chain of command, the hierarchy, has to be built. There is no alternative. There is absolutely no alternative. Again, Mr. Coolmug, your colonies conquered nearby American Indian tribes for their survival. Okay, so what? I don't get it. Your politics rejects defending against the alien tribes which are coming in. No, it does not. See, it's not either or. You can still support Trump. You can still vote for conservatives and lobby for the wall to be built and slow down the decline, but the minoritarian strategy is just saying that, you know, you need some kind of more fundamental basis for organizing people than like Americanism or nationalism in the traditional sense. These things will not last. They aren't lasting. The decline has been consistent over the past 150 years. maybe not 150, maybe 100 years. Globalism has been on the rise. Nationalism has been on the decline. Ethnic frameworks need some kind of metaphysical basis. They do, in actual fact. Ethno-religions are the way that religion is done. You have tribal deities. You have tribal cosmologies. You have tribal sacred spaces and rituals. This is what allows for a consistent breeding population, apart from just language. And that has to be reconstructed along the lines that are received, but that's why the minoritarian strategy is something separate from just nationalism. And I think as an individual, you want to devote your energies to where you are in control, which is at that voluntary community level. Okay, so Sam Ludwig likes what I'm saying, so that's good to hear. And then, so I'm not going to read all of your chats that you're having, Ken, but can you summarize for us who aren't reading the chat what you're talking about?
Yeah, I don't know. It's this thing, this Mr. Kulmag, I feel like it's been weeks or months of him saying that if you have a plan B, then that means, well, in my mind, it's the reverse. In my mind, the most likely scenario is trends continue and whites become a minority, and you do the best you can and you don't give up. You don't say, oh, we're outnumbered, I guess we have to kill ourselves now. You pursue the strategy that all minorities have everywhere from, the beginning of history to the present day. So you do that, and that's kind of your plan A. Plan B is support Trump, try to stop immigration, try to reverse immigration, try to get back to an ethno state. I don't think that's going to happen, but I'm a decelerationist. I believe that rather than accelerating the collapse of society, we should be trying to slow down these radical changes. I think we should push back. And every time the left tries to advance their agenda, we should be trying to stifle them, and we should try to reverse their agenda. That is a worthy goal that I think people can pursue. But if we fail in that, it's not that we don't have recourse. So, I mean, whether you think of it as the plan A or the plan B, these are two plans which are not in contradiction with each other. If I say, hey, I don't want to be a minority, but if I am a minority, here's what I'm going to do to survive. Minorities can survive. The idea that, like, in South Africa right now, they are passing laws to steal land from white people. I have looked at the headlines. Now, I don't know what's going to happen in South Africa. I've never been there, but I see mainstream headlines, mainstream news websites talking about this. When I open up, my news feed, maybe it's spying on me and figuring out what I like to read about. But these are the first headlines I'm seeing that they're saying white genocide is going on. I mean, Lauren Southern is talking about this. So she's not like a fringe figure. She's on tour in all these places. And this is something that's in the public. So it could go either way. Either they do get the land stolen and then it's a Zimbabwe situation. But even in Zimbabwe, there are whites being invited back into Zimbabwe. So it's never a hopeless case. Like you can bring, you could have 100 white people left in the country and still have a chance of regaining power and not being genocided. So I think there's always a chance, but he's making, we should stifle them. We're in agreement. America is minority white. Like that is the demographic. So if you look at the kids being born today, a minority of them are white, and that will continue to be the case. And that situation will grow worse. It will only compound itself. So white people are not a majority. Okay. White people living in assisted living at the age of 80 who are draining the healthcare resources of the country at the tune to millions of dollars a year, they are not an asset to the white community. So when we talk about demography and we count the statistics and we say there are this many white people and this many non-white people, whites are the only group who are declining as an absolute number. That means every year there are less white people as an absolute. Now I could pull up the statistics another time. I don't have them in front of me, but every other group, Blacks, Hispanics, American Indians, all of them are increasing in absolute terms. Now, Blacks are actually decreasing as a proportion because other groups are growing at a faster rate. But still, absolutely, they are growing. White people are not just leaving the country, they are dying off. They're not having kids, they're committing suicide, they're having the drug overdose. So it is a minority situation. Now, theoretically, if you had some super Trump who comes in 2024 or something, they could stop immigration, reverse immigration, increase immigration from Europe, increase white birth rates, and eventually we could become a majority again. I'm not saying that would be theoretically impossible. I'm just saying it's not likely. We are currently a minority. Fighting age men, white fighting age men are less than 50% of the total number of fighting age men in the country. And that is really what matters. The fact that we have a bunch of old grandpas and grannies living in nursing homes, in a vegetative like state who are technically white. Like, yes, if you walk into a nursing home, most people are white. And theoretically on the books, they have large assets. They're going to pass on an inheritance or whatever. But these are the facts. Like, this is something that you could argue with me in like 1980s or the 1990s, maybe the early 2000s. But we're in the current year. The statistics are what they are. Don't tell me that, oh, well, you're 65% white. Like, you just need to hold on to that majority, because that's not how demographic pyramids work. If you think that's all there is to demographics, you have not studied demography. So go a little bit deeper than the initial Wikipedia article.
All right. So Lightning Patriot asks, any recommendations for what jobs to go into to acquire money to create a colony? It's hard to plan a career because we don't know what's really going away to automation. If you can do programming, there's still work to be had, and basically go on the jobs lists and see what jobs are actually out there. Becoming a truck driver, you make good money and the jobs are out there. Becoming an electrician is probably less, it's more of a barrier to entry. Becoming a mechanic, there's actually a lot of competition depending on where you are. Like, these trades are decent ways of making good money. Being a programmer is probably, if you're smart enough for it, one of the better ways to go. If you're going to go to college, I don't know about that. If there's anything now that's actually worth going to college for. Because even if you go for mechanical engineering, I know people who have college degrees in mechanical engineering who are out of work. Some things seem safe, but I don't know. If anything, be a truck driver while you still can. You make a lot of money. Mr. Coolmug, how is this ethno-religious movement going to come about? What is it based on? So, like, Ken was arguing why we need to start thinking in terms of minoritarian strategies, because just given the trends, we are effectively going to be a minority, and kind of already are, in the sense that he says young fighting age men are already a plurality and not an absolute majority. So, but for me, it's more about, to create a coherent community, I want that philosophical integrity. Communities that last have cosmologies, they have cosmogonies, they have an end of history, they have a complete worldview, which we just don't have. Now, if you're Orthodox, or if you're Catholic, or even if you're Protestant, you can at least tell yourself that you have that integrated framework. And it's not like I don't understand Christian doctrine. Like, I do understand. It's just that there's no reason to believe most of the stuff. It's just the tradition. I need a reason to believe things, because for me, there's always the possibility that this was corrupted in the early days, and the tradition to be handed down wasn't sanctioned by God. Look, there are other traditions around the world that weren't sanctioned by God, right? So I can't just have absolute faith that something wasn't put there to manipulate me. Therefore, philosophy is what I go to. The perennial philosophy is what I've come to, and that means then I can use religious frameworks to maintain the integrity of this system. It's not all philosophical integrity. There's also ritualistic integrity, moral integrity, and just this kind of, I don't know how to articulate it, but like the life force of a civilization, that has to be something that's tangible to people, and Christianity has been losing its potency in this respect. Mormonism was an example of someone offering a context, like a metaphysical context for people that made sense to them. Now, it was much more materialistic, and it was all narrative based in a sense that Americans could relate to, and so that's why it was successful. But I think the market is similar, and we're looking at a revolutionary cosmological age where in the last 100 years, all of our notions of what the world is in the first place have changed radically, and we don't see a religious shift to account for this. There are some examples like Scientology or Falun Gong, which is one of the largest religions in the world, actually. I mean, it's on the list of the top 20 or whatever. There are about 10 million followers, and I'm actually very intimately familiar with it. Falun Gong, likewise, takes advantage of this new cosmology that we have to incorporate past religious ideas in a way that people can actually identify with today. Okay, so it looks like Ken's going to have to go. We might have to wrap this up because I also have to go in about 10 minutes. But anyway, thanks guys for tuning in. And then Ken, do you have any last comment that you want to say? You're muted. Ken?
All right, now I'm unmuted.
Yeah.
It was a lively chat. Had a good time. I think it was an improvement on our last one, despite the technical difficulties, and hope to do it again soon.
Yep. Talk to you guys probably next Saturday, but we'll see. All right. Have a good week.